Hello all and welcome. We're going to give a few seconds just to get everyone in the room here today, and then we will get started. Welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Okay, hello everyone. We are going to get started. My name is Kara Q. Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I'd like to acknowledge that I am zooming in from the territory of the Nisenan people, as well as potentially unrecognized tribes, also known as Sacramento. I am the manager of programs and organizational advancement with Californians for the Arts, and we are glad to have you here today. We ask and welcome you to please introduce yourself in the chat and where you are coming from today. On behalf of everyone at Californians for the Arts, again, welcome to the third program in the Arts Work webinar series, where we take a deeper dive into how artists, arts workers, and culture bearers work to create vital social impacts and what the creative workforce needs to succeed and thrive in California. Each week in April brings a panel of thought leaders and practitioners together around one of the themes of Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month to share their change-making work and to discuss new strategic possibilities and the policy changes that we should be thinking about. Today's discussion will focus on how the arts work to advance social justice and racial equity. Before I hand it over to today's moderator and our fantastic panelists, a little bit of housekeeping. Throughout the program, please feel free to use the chat to share resources or to share reactions or comments to what you are hearing today. There will be a Q&A at the end of the panel. You can enter questions into the Q&A box in Zoom at any point during the conversation. And a note that Sofina Brown is unable to be here today due to an unavoidable conflict. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Gustavo Herrera, CEO of Arts for LA and valued Californians for the Arts board member. Gustavo?
Amazing. Hey, Kara, thank you so much for that introduction, and hello, everybody. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. We are actually going to start this off with a performance by Jason Shu. So let's go ahead and cue up that video.
Ay, yeah. Foreign, ay, yeah. When you look at me, what do you see? I can guarantee we not so different. Citizen, though you may not believe, cause you look at us like we just immigrants in this so-called land of the free. Ain't no 40 acres with no picket fence. Citizen, though you may not believe, why you look at us like we just immigrants? Everybody want a foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner. Everybody want a foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner. Sing a song of frozen waves and napalm flames, yeah. 50 years and neighbors still ain't learned her name, yeah. Live in New York, but they cut him on the train. You know that ID card don't cut it when your face is held to blame. Like Nakayama time I wasn't training for the army. Sergeant pointed at our brother, that's the face that you should target. That's the 60s, ancient change, just a function of the culture. They love us, we a model, and they treat us like a problem, just they pawns. I had to get this off my chest. For our kings, for our queens, all the nights they bled. Red as the American flag, we earned our stripes, I guess. Spit till I'm blue in the face, I still ain't white, I guess. Microaggressive, yeah, that's how we get this, yeah. Having the dog proved it inflict traumatic stresses, yeah. Foreign in our own nation, 9/11, 4 days went by. Balbia Singh sold and murdered at his gas station, ayy. Everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner. Everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner. We came a long way from being immigrants, alien, foreign, but they don't see us as real citizens. Sway in the morning, Taurus the best, intruders the worst. The way they perceive us, portrayed us on TV as weak, made us hate our own features. Anti-Asian propaganda on the back of pamphlets. Either with a foreigner or spy next door like Jackie Chan flicks. Model minority, that myth was fueled to half as gaslit, was also used to justify this country's anti-blackness. Victims of Orientalism, whether you're born into the system or migrated, stuck with the perpetual foreign Asian syndrome. They're like, where you from? Not like where you really from. Which one of your relatives did we go to war with in 1951? As a test of loyalty, they want us to diss our people for claps. But I'd rather take a knee to that than pledge allegiance, no cap. Anything that happens in Asia, they pointed us even though we live here. Been treating us like an illness way before COVID appeared. I'm saying, everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner. Everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner. Everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner. Everybody wanna foreign, but nobody wanna be a foreigner, foreigner.
Amazing. So welcome everybody. My name is Gustavo Herrera, and again, I'm the CEO of Arts for LA. I'm also a proud board member of Californians for the Arts. I love that Jason Chu and Alan Z's powerful song, Foreigner. I personally relate to this song. I really feel seen by this art, Jason. I'm the son of two Salvadoran parents who migrated to this country as a result of the 1980s Civil War. I want y'all to know also that Arts for LA is also currently conducting a study on undocumented creatives. And what we know so far is that there are over 100,000 undocumented creatives in Los Angeles alone, who I know relate to this song too. So I am so excited to moderate today's panel on how the arts work to advance social justice and racial equity. As I was beginning to prepare for this panel, I came across the words of Jesus Barraza, who is the co-founder of Dignidad Rebelde. He co-founded that organization alongside of Melanie Cervantes. To those of you who may or may not know, Dignidad Rebelde is a graphic arts collaborative whose work really focuses on this intersection between art and social justice. And I was watching this video of Jesus as I was preparing for this panel, and Jesus was really reflecting on his work as an artist. He was reflecting on his work as a co-founder of this organization that, again, uses the medium of art to advance social justice and racial equity issues. And in his reflection in this video, he says the following. I'm going to read this to you. He says, I think for us, it's really in the politics. And for us, the way that we push the work forward, it's not about criticizing each other or to put each other down or to try to dominate. It comes out of for us. How do we make things better? How do we push the politics? And how do we make sure that in the end, what we're producing is really in service to movement? And I really want to pull and highlight that line, in service to movement. The arts working to advance a movement towards social justice and racial equity. Today's panelists are a brilliant, brilliant group of leaders with all sorts of unique vantage points. And I'm going to take a moment now to introduce you to this incredible panel. So if our panelists can actually turn on their cameras. And I'm going to do my best here to highlight some of the high points of their bios. But believe me, all, as I was going through these bios, it's not easy to try and summarize everything that these group of leaders has done because they're truly, truly extraordinary leaders. But I'm going to start here with Jason Chu. Jason is a rapper, activist who speaks hope and healing in a broken world. Grew up as a Chinese American kid in suburban Delaware. He found a vocabulary for racial identity and liberation in the sounds and culture of rap and hip hop. Most recently, Jason has been recognized as a 2022 Artist at Work Fellow at the Japanese American National Museum. His work has been presented, shout out Japanese American National Museum. His work has been presented on the National Mall in Washington, DC, and In America, Remember, and curated in the Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs virtual exhibition, Reimagine Public Art, House and Home. Jason has been heard on Warrior, HBO Max, Tetris Beat, Snowpiercer, and Woo across all kinds of platforms, HBO Max, Apple Arcade, TNT, and Netflix. He has shared poetry at the Obama White House. He is a contributor to the St. James Encyclopedia of Hip Hop Culture. Welcome, Jason. I'm going to shift over to Betty Marin. Betty is a cultural worker from Wilmington, California. Her work centers on using popular education and language justice to create space that encourages learning, dialogue, and solidarity between different communities. She organizes against displacement and gentrification with the LA Tenants Union. She promotes language justice with Antenna LA. She manages ACTA's cultural treasure mapping work, including the Promise Zone arts projects. She supports Artist Fellows campaign work with the Boyle Heights Building Healthy Communities program. She also supports the coordination of the Traditional Arts Roundtable series. Betty joined ACTA in July of 2018. Welcome, Betty. And now I'll introduce Fabian. Fabian Deborah was born in El Paso, Texas, and he began his career in 1995 as a member of the East Los Angeles Streetscapers. He was mentored by many Chicano artists and muralists and was introduced to creative expression of all forms, from graffiti and murals to sketching and fine art painting. Fabian has served as a counselor and director of substance abuse services and programming, as well as a mentor at Homeboy Industries, Los Angeles, for a decade. He then moved on and worked as a community connection director at Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network. He's a teaching artist for ACTA, Alliance of Traditional Arts. He works in collaboration with the Latino Producers Action Network, and now he has returned to Homeboy Industries as the executive director of Homeboy Art Academy. Welcome, Fabian. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce you to Erica. Erica describes as a policy analyst, educator, taiko artist, cultural ambassador. She is a systems level leader, a project manager, an educator, an advocate specializing in K through 12 public education, performing arts, and US-Japan relations. She is driven by enacting positive social change through education reform. She's a current legislative analyst for the US House of Representatives, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She is also the chair of the Emerging Leaders Program Steering Committee for the US-Japan Council. Welcome, Erica. So, as I mentioned, very, very difficult to try and be concise with the incredible accomplishments of this group. To all of the attendees, thank you for making time to join us during a lunchtime on a Friday for this important conversation. Today's conversation, I hope, will help you better understand these leaders as people. I hope that you'll gain a better understanding of the ways in which they are leveraging and utilizing the power of the arts to advance social justice and racial equity. And lastly, we'll also chat about how as leaders, these individuals are measuring progress on what they're doing to drive change in this world. As Kara mentioned at the top of the meeting, we'll have about 20 minutes for you to ask questions of this incredible panel. But with that, let's get started. So my first question to whomever wants to take it here is: the arts are a field of storytellers. I'd like for you to start there with us. Tell us your story, tell us your journey, and what led you to where you are today.
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead, Fabian.
No, Go ahead, lady.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's good to see people's names in the chat, even though we can't see your faces. And thank you for the CFTA for organizing, and of course, Gustavo for facilitating. Yeah, in terms of my journey, I think it's always been a path of trying to find a place where I'm working towards justice through the arts. So, you know, as a young person, being interested in drawing and painting, and also being politicized and learning about the Zapatista movement, and then, you know, sort of prioritizing justice in a way in my undergrad, feeling like I needed to really understand why our world was in the condition it was. So it's always been this struggle of like, how do I do both? And that's led me to do a lot of educational work. I got to work in Mexico for a couple years, creating educational experiences for people to understand US policy impacts in Mexico and why people migrate from places like Mexico. And that really kind of solidified my understanding of my creative practice as an educational practice. And that kind of led me to work with different institutions, and it's eventually brought me to where I am today, which is the Alliance for California Traditional Arts. And so what this place has been for me now is an opportunity to also think about my cultural upbringing and create also like a theoretical framework around folk and traditional arts, which were not necessarily the arts that I had been focusing on, but I had grown up with. You know, I'm a child of Mexican immigrants from rural Zacatecas, and I grew up with, you know, norteño music. I grew up with uncle and cousins who played music at every family party, and they still do. And in the recent loss of my grandmother, the singing and praying together has been an important part of our healing. So just thinking about that cultural experience, and then doing that work today, largely in Boyle Heights, since I'm based in Los Angeles, but of course, ACTA's work is across the state in different prisons and also in different communities, supporting folk and traditional arts to, you know, both artists and organizations to be able to sustain folk and traditional arts practice, understanding that it can be a source of healing and also a source and way for communities to organize themselves and to be able to really, you know, fight for and create the changes that they want.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Betty. And I want to talk about that a little bit further with you. But before we do, Fabian, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I come from both immigrant parents. I was born in El Paso, Texas, as you mentioned, and we're from Zacatecas as well. My family migrated up to Juarez, Chihuahua, for the Bracero party. My grandfather then they made me a U.S. citizen born in El Paso, Texas. But again, my mother and father had a big this idea of coming to Los Angeles in 1980. And we arrived in the housing projects of Aliso Village, Pico Aliso. And in those times, the 80s, as we know it, it was the decade of violence and crack cocaine epidemic and the Ronnie Keene uprising during all those times. So it was very difficult for me as a young one to try to find some grounding here and having to bear the injustices that came with immigration, and yet, having a sense of access, supposedly, right? A sense of access that my parents didn't have, it's confusing. So growing up in those projects, I think for me, what got me and prepared me to do this type of work is knowing and understanding the dysfunction that came from the household, domestic violence, abuse, neglect, and all those things. Also, that plagued my environment, my community. In the projects, there was many of us who were impacted in if not, if not, in similar ways. So again, the refuge for me was gang culture. So at the age of 12, I joined gangs on top of all the other things that I have already been encountered with. And when I joined gangs, there was a sense of refuge for me, being that my father was in and out of prison. He would travel, he would leave us for a long time to go do prison terms. But one thing that happened to me as a young man, and I start to learn as a young one, the exclusion and the stigmas and what's considered art and what's not art, right? And so as a young one, being a graffiti artist, that too in itself was stereotype or stigma. It's not art, it's vandalism. And then also picking up the tattoo machine, that is not that, always being told that is not, that is not, that is not. So eventually, at a young age, though, what I did discover through all the pain, through all the trauma, through all those experiences, when I would do art, I would pick up my notebook and I would create my own worlds to escape my reality. That did something for me. And it gave me a sense of peace, a sense of hope, a sense of self-worth. And that's when I knew art was special, and it came with a particular gift. And throughout the trajectory, of course, in gangs and everything, knowing Father Greg Boyle, founder of Homeboy Industries since I was 10, I wanted to do something about it. And I think for me, it was about how to then now that I've found my own healing and transformation away from gang culture, utilizing the arts, then how can I create my own entity, how can I create access for those young men and women who are still struggling with the same issues till this day? And so what I do is I hone in on gang impacted, gang involved youth and adult. And I think that is my cup of tea. That's what I really live and breathe for, because there is so much talent in these communities. And we're now living in better times, better places, although there's still criterias and requirements that are exclusive and don't open the door fully and wider, which we can talk about down the line. But the fact that I was able to create my own entity, create my own space, and utilize the arts to help these young men reconnect with their true identities and their ancestral lineages, I think that's the way of advocacy and disrupting, a system that has been impacting us for a very long time. So that's me, and I've been successful at it, and it's amazing to watch, how the power of the arts are really transforming the lives of those young men and women gang involved.
I appreciate that, Fabian. So much of what you shared, I relate to, and I love how you say the arts in helping those young folks connect to their true identity, and really, really powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Erica, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I am also a daughter of two immigrants from the Nagoya Aichiken Prefecture of Japan. And, I would say a lot of what I do in terms of advocacy, civil rights action, what propels me is growing up seeing all the, discrimination or lack of access that my parents, often were in those situations, and wanting to make sure that others like me and like them had the opportunities. And I saw education very much as a way to provide, resources to, next generations and their parents and the families connected to them. So that's why I've spent a good chunk of my first part of the career as a public school teacher, mostly directing bands in schools. But at the same time, music has been my outlet in terms of self-expression. And, with that, I think a lot of artists, we have the ability to communicate, not just verbally, but it's the nonverbal communication pieces that make us stronger and more impactful in many ways. And so long story short, I am an educator, still use those skills, but always have been a taiko, Japanese taiko performer as well. I spent 2 years in Japan with a professional group. And it was there where I felt restrictions against my self-expression that really inspired me to do more with the freedoms that I have in the US. So when I returned, I decided to do more with advocacy. And so now I'm working for Congresswoman Barbara Lee, at really identifying those barriers for access, not just for the arts, but across all sectors, and holding federal agencies, anything federal funding disbursements accountable to make sure that we are addressing barriers that are often rooted in systemic racism. And so we're working to call that out and finding solutions for it.
Amazing. Thank you, Erica. And you're working on such an important, I would argue, one of the most important pieces of legislation, federal legislation out there for cultural advocates. And I know you're going to talk more about that later today. So very, very excited for the community to learn about the incredible work that Congresswoman Lee and that you were both leading in that regard. So thank you for that work that you're doing. And actually, before I turn it over to Jason, I just want to connect one dot. The video that we opened up with is our artist, Jason. And so I'll let you share a little bit more, Jason, about yourself and your journey.
Yeah, what's up, folks? So my name is Jason Chu. I'm a Chinese American rapper, educator, and activist. And it's really a dream to be here with y'all, literally a dream, because this is the kind of thing that, if you told young Jason, 12-year-old, 16-year-old, 20-year-old Jason, like, hey, this is the work that you're going to get to do, and these are the conversations you're going to get to contribute to, I would have never believed it, because I think specifically, right, and particularly for so many of our marginalized communities, finding these outlets for our voices, it's such a battle to know the value of our voices and our identities and our social locations. It's a battle for us, not to mention imagining that others will value and will hear and will build with us is super powerful. So what I always say, I'm on tour right now. I'm actually sitting in a hotel room in Boston. I'm on tour with my friends Alan Z, who is a Chinese American rapper and singer in Atlanta, and our friend Jamel Mims, who is a Black bilingual English and Mandarin rapper from Harlem. And one thing Jamel and I talk about a lot, we do this workshop, Rap, Race, and Revolution, where Jamel says it was going to China that made him a rapper, as he saw how a lot of young Chinese folks were using their voices and inspired him to say, hey, like, there's things I want to say too. And what I always say in tandem with that is that it was hip hop culture that taught me how to be Asian American. And what I mean by that is that particularly for a lot of AAPI or ANHPI folks, our racial identities are erased. And what I mean by that is that we're taught that, you're Asian and you're American, so of course you're Asian American. But but the legacy and the history of our ancestors. And here I don't just mean ancestors in Asia, but I mean our ancestors who fought this fight in America. 170 plus years of communal history in America is erased from textbooks and erased from popular culture and imagination. But it was through hip hop that I learned to value to value the strength that can be drawn from knowing your ancestry and knowing your forebears. I would hear Black and brown artists talking about, the struggles of those who came before them and using that imagery to draw their present day, to ground their present day fights and needs and the oppression and the liberation that they see and that they're seeking. And that actually really was what drove me into Asian American studies. My master's degree is a hybrid degree, including Asian American studies. And so if it weren't for hip hop, I think I would not have seen in so many ways my Asian American, Chinese American identity as a source of strength. And so that's a lot of the work that I do now. I'm very, very, very proud to be an Artist at Work Fellow for 2022 at the Japanese American National Museum. So I saw Rick Noguchi is in the chat. And
Jason, I know that you've been thinking deeply. I want to build off what you just said, because I know that you've been thinking deeply about how art can portray history, and how art can really be generative. Talk to us about the opportunity that you see in using your storytelling to portray Asian American history.
Yeah, I think that, for me, I think often about the bifurcation between arts and entertainment. And I think about how you use a similar skill set in both industries, as it were. But the difference is that entertainment, and I don't want to say exploit in a very, very negative way, but right, entertainment, the outcome is finances. It's using stories, leveraging stories to make funds. Whereas I think art fundamentally has a different goal, which is the portrayal of truth. And it's not always the truth as people see it, but it's an aspirational truth. It's, as you said, and as we've talked about before, it's a generative truth, right? It's a vision of the world, not as it is. And one thing I said on a podcast recently is, I think one thing that's amazing about art is it can show not just a better world, but a different world. You know what I'm saying? Not just the world that we have, but a little better. Hey, this policy tweaks a little, or these people live a little better, but a different world. Yeah. Radically reimagining how we see ourselves and we see others. And to me, that's the power of art. I worked in the 501c3 sector for several years. And I'm very, very, very happy to still be affiliated with several nonprofits. But I realized, as it sounds like many of my fellow panelists today do, that they go hand in hand, right? Mm-hmm. The work that we're doing to get grants, to get funding, to distribute resources goes hand in hand with having that generative, aspirational vision of how things are. Because if you only have one and not the other, right? If you only have the vision, but not the ground game, then you don't go anywhere. But vice versa, if you've got great ground game, but you don't have people around you or that generative muse and spirit within yourself to say, this is what I'm driving toward, have a clear vision of a different version of the world, then that also just stagnates, right? So that's a lot about what I think.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Love that art is the portrayal of truth. I want to shift over to Betty. Betty, you're an powerful community arts leader. You're an educator. You're really in the business of changing conditions. And so tell us how you approach this condition changing work through the arts. And I'm really hoping you can touch base also on some of this community asset map work that you've been working on too.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think in terms of changing conditions, it's really about starting with people, right? It's about relationships, and it's about creating shared spaces through cultural practice, and also being able to identify what are the cultural practices that shape our everyday, and how can we bring them into these political and social spaces where we're trying to create this change, whether it's through music or through quilting or through, collective songwriting or drumming or dance or, mural making, whatever cultural form that we align ourselves with. And so I think in this vision of starting with community and our own cultural practices is very tied to this idea of cultural asset mapping, which I think is, a methodology that lots of different groups and organizations have taken on. And what it's really about is acknowledging the resources that are already existing in a community. Often when we talk about communities that, we talk about, these communities as having less resources, right? Or, poor communities as we think about them through this deficit model of what they're lacking, whether it's, around health or education. But in approaching those same problems, cultural asset mapping is asking, well, what do the communities actually, what are they bringing to the table to creating these solutions? So who are the people, who are the places, what are the events? Who are the people who are leading cultural work in the community? We call them culture bearers, people who, make it a point to either teach cultural forms or, organize events around cultural practice. Lots of people, there might be spaces that people feel connected to each other in, they feel identified with, and that then supports them in their continued work in the community. So that's really what cultural asset mapping is about, is just creating a system where we're acknowledging what's already helping sustain us as a community, and how can we further highlight and build on those resources to come up with the solutions that we need in our community. One thing we're doing in Boyle Heights right now, there's the Boyle Heights community plan, right? Just as there is a community plan for any neighborhood in the city of Los Angeles. And often, those plans are built around, they're about development, they're about thinking about housing and safety and other issues in a community. And so what we're trying to bring to that plan is asking the question of, like, where does cultural practice fit into the plan, or where do cultural resources fit into the plan? So, kind of switching the question to, what are the problems, to, like, what are the resources, and seeing how that kind of shifts our approach and our solutions.
Yeah, it's such an important approach, I think, and thank you for helping unpack that a little bit. I'm going to switch over here to Fabian. The arts really have the power to reimagine unjust systems. And so can you, Fabian, tell us about the work that you're leading through the Homeboy Art Academy, and really, if you can dig into the massive barriers that you see on a day-to-day for both workers and leaders.
No, yeah, absolutely. I think it's very complex, right? Especially when you're investing in formerly gang involved, formerly incarcerated young men and women. The reimagining seems so far from reach, right, for them. And so it is my responsibility and duty to make sure that we continue to compel and help them. And so the way I function in the academy, in order for us to know where we're going, we need to know where we're coming from, in a sense, right? So I roll with the 3 R's. And the way I carry that out in the space is that it's important for the young men and women gang involved to help them to reconnect to self. Once they are able to reconnect to self through the various arts disciplines, through the various approaches and practices, then we can begin to re-identify to our true self. And through various practices, disciplines in the arts and everything, we are intentional about helping them re-identify. And then we can begin to reimagine what a future can look like, right? What that pathway may be. And that's a 3R framework that I've developed. And a lot of it comes from my own personal lived experience. Some people call it workshop. I call it ceremony. There's a beginning, a journey, and an end. And it is all comes from stems from my own upbringing, my own personal lived experience, where it is important that we take ownership of our own narratives. For many years, the gang member has been despised, demonized, in ways that we are terrorists or we do not belong and they're good for nothing. They never all those labels, So my responsibility as an artist is to help them take ownership of their narratives and begin to redefine what those considered to be labels are, or let's remove them from the path, right? There's no such thing. And so, and that has been instrumental. I mean, I think Father Greg at Homeboy Industries, I mean, to be honest with you, a lot of my traditional practices, and I have to take it all the way back because there's various approaches. And so for me, my ceremonial approach has come from my own personal experience with the Shumas. I was taken to the Native American reservation, indigenous reservation of Mahutasan. And as a young man, alcoholic, drug addict, gang member, they would pluck me out of the city of Los Angeles to go take me to the reservation. And there is when I start to learn and develop all those teachings that came from traditional, right, indigenous folks. And they taught us all the disciplines and how to really carry ourselves in ceremony. Everything's intentional and all that. And then later to come to Homeboy and then also get that type of approach and those healing elements that come from that space. And then I say to myself, how do I take this, my own experience in gangs, the Native American practices, and then what I've got it at Homeboy, put it all together and come up with my own solution. But I think what it is that we still encounter a lot of barriers. There's still a lot of barriers. A lot of institutions aren't ready to open the door fully. And so for me, it's about how do I invite the institutions or those spaces in the world to help us be part of the solution. Right. But when I see grants or I see various opportunities, I'm still finding some of them to say, the youth must be 18, carry a 3.5 GPA, and then I'm like, done. Let's go to the next one. Right. Move it along, because that ain't gonna happen with my kids, in a sense. It could, but it's not tailored to the populations that I'm working with. So then that signifies that we're still not there yet, right? So it is important to empower the youth, youth leadership, youth driven, and what I see is there's a lot. I mean, it's complex because a lot of these kids are dealing with homelessness. They're dealing with drug addiction. They're dealing with single mothers, and they're obligated to help those families, So it's important that when we think about building community, and when we think about a community, then it should be all inclusive. And that's why it's important for me and the academy to work with the elderly all the way down to the elementary school student, because we as adults have also made mistakes. We have been comparing, and using those outcast folks to keep our youth or our kids straight. If you do drugs, you're going to end up like that. If you don't go to school, you're going to end up like him. And that in itself is divisive. Yeah. And so I feel that by bringing all those cultural, what they call it, multi-generational, and all those experiences into the space, together we can build community. And that's how we bridge the divide that has been happening, that has been created by the systemic infrastructures of injustices, and we do it very well. And I can give you a quick rundown. I know I don't want to take too much time, but like, for example, Mondays at the Academy, we do visual arts. And in these visual arts, we invite the young men and women to think about a person, someone in their lives that meant a lot to them, whether they're in the physical or in the spiritual world. That in itself is a sense of resourcing them, reminding them of their power that they have within. On Tuesdays, we will have the elder, Tina Calderon, from the Tongva. She's been with us and continues to hold space for us at the Academy. And she brings in all the teachings of the Tongva and all the songs and storytelling and beating and all these traditional practices. Wednesdays, we do music production, recording, and instrument, and then on Thursdays, we do photography class with Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory. And Fridays, we do multimedia. So we have a full spectrum of services in the Academy. And for me, it should never be linear. In my experience, it's not the youth experience, but how do we create one? And that's coexisting. And together we can then disrupt and change the conditions that we're encountered with. And so that is like the formula that I use, and it's mainly led by the youth. I have my thing here, but the youth are the ones who provoke thought and emotion to change conditions.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that, Fabian. And it looks like someone's asking if there's a link to your work, because it's very, very inspiring work. I also want to amplify something that you said. You know, there are a lot of folks in the room here who are employers and who are creating, you know, some of these job descriptions and some of the things that Fabian highlighted about creating more inclusive descriptions that might provide opportunity for a workforce. Really, really important. So just want to really amplify that. Erica, and you are working, I brought this up earlier, the Advancing Equity Through the Arts and Humanities Act. One of the most important pieces of federal legislation, and you've got a room here, Erica, folks who care deeply about the arts, who care deeply about equity, social justice, racial equity, and so and are advocates. And so can you share more about this federal legislation so that folks better understand the legislation, and also for folks who want to do more, what can they do?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, I'm so happy to be speaking to the choir of, you know, when I say a statement like dismantling structural racism through the arts and humanities is critical to the health of our nation, I'll probably get a lot of head nods. You know, I mean, this is basically what this bill stands for, is addressing the fact that, you know, a lot of funds, federal funds that go out to support arts and humanities projects are often sent to larger organizations. But what about smaller, minority-led, minority-owned artists and creatives, right? You all are doing so much in this space, and just by doing the work that you do in its existence, you're already working to dismantle structural racism. And you know, in speaking with National Endowment of Humanities and Arts, you know, we've never seen a bill like this, you know, what's going to happen. And there's quite a stir happening even before we've even introduced the bill. But this is definitely a bill that's reflective of this moment, and probably something we needed decades ago, but here it is now. But specifically, the legislation would create a pilot program, or a program, not just a pilot program, supplemental funding through the NEA and NEH to provide grants to increase engagement with public and nonprofit entities, which include faith-based and community-based organizations that serve and are led by people of color, and to support arts and humanities projects that directly combat systemic racism through the arts and humanities. And you know, if you read through the bill, you'll see we have a whole findings section to uplift the fact that, you know, the public narrative when we talk about arts is often, you know, the entertainment, as Jason mentioned earlier, but really the benefits and what we're seeing in our communities is just so much deeper than that. And so we start the bill out by uplifting what arts and humanities is actually doing for this nation, and how we need to take a stronger stance from the federal level to support artists, and especially those until now, or who often have barriers to getting grants and funding projects, or, you know, just don't have the national spotlight. So we plan to introduce the bill, so I think it's April 28th. So it's coming up here. And currently we're in the phase of looking for endorsing organizations. Typically federal legislation, you won't find, you know, individuals or smaller organizations listed. But because this bill stands for, you know, individual creatives, artists, we want to see artist names, all the way from artist names all the way to national arts-based organizations, social justice organizations. So please do share this endorsement, link to endorse widely. Please consider it for yourselves to support. And, also just going back to the fact that a lot of people have talked about this issue a lot, but so far there's never been a bill like this at the federal level. In my search, there's actually more bills that try to remove federal funding for the arts and humanities than there are to support it. And that is, very sad to see. So this bill is a platform, the strength, wonderful if we can get it passed and this new grant program authorized. But I think the true strength here is that we can uplift the issue at the national level, at the federal level, start talking about it, also give political coverage to organizations like NEA and NEH and other national groups that have wanted to speak publicly about it, but may have had political restrictions. So in terms of messaging, we want to make sure that we're empowering artists and organizations to bring together the discussion of how do artists and creatives, what is their role in terms of dismantling structural racism. So just really honored to work for a congresswoman who understands these issues and stands for them, and is not afraid to speak out about it.
Yeah, and thank you to Congresswoman Lee's leadership and your leadership on this. You heard it here first, folks. Late April 28th, it sounds like this bill will be introduced, and then there will be opportunities to look at it more carefully. So very, very important piece of legislation. And again, thank you for your leadership. I want to, and one thing that you shared also, Erica, really resonates, that this community, I know Californians for the Arts, Arts for LA, and many of the organizations here, we've spent, prior to COVID, we've spent an extraordinary amount of time just defending NEA budgets and NEA budget cuts, and then all of those cuts that happen year to year. And so to see a proactive bill like this in this moment is just really, really important, and one that is explicitly addressing equity and connecting the dots between how the arts can advance social justice and so forth. Very, very important. So I want to thread out here this theme of barriers to entry, because I think Jason brought this up earlier, especially as related, barriers into the industry. Fabian brought this up, barriers to employment. Erica also brought it's a thread. And so here's the question for you all. The arts have incredible barriers to entry for so many communities, and the demographics of the arts workforce really represent the impact of those barriers. And I'll share with you, some of the numbers that we use at Arts for LA, for example. When we look at the arts and culture non-for-profit sector in Los Angeles, it's about 3/5 of the community self-identifies, arts workers self-identify as white, when 26% of the Los Angeles community self-identifies as white. When we look at state numbers, numbers are around 55% of arts workers sort of self-identify as white. There's just not a lot of diversity and representation when we actually live in a city, in a county, and in a state that's very, very diverse. And so question for the group is, what do we need to do to begin to remove barriers to art and to the arts workforce?
I'll jump in. I think one huge barrier is language. We function in a very English dominant place in terms of the art sector, every sector. Lots of our spaces are in English, just as I just talked today. And, you know, as many of us know, California is a rich state in terms of immigrants and other communities, Native peoples who also operate in different languages, you know, millions and millions of people who are organizing themselves and, you know, organizing their communities in different languages. And so that's like a huge gap in terms of what people are able to access. And it's something that we encounter too with the artists that we work with. And just in terms of, you know, the grants funding world, it's basically primarily, you know, I would say 98% as far as I can experience in English. So that's a huge barrier. And also within that, a lot of the artists we work with, and you mentioned this earlier, Gustavo, are undocumented. When we're thinking again about a lot of the immigrant communities that we work with. And so that's another barrier to access that's often aligned with language. So I think just in terms of like some, you know, some of the work that we do at ACTA is definitely trying to uplift language justice and, you know, create bilingual spaces, at least in Spanish and English, of course, Spanish being, you know, the second largest language group in California. But, you know, there's so much more work that we can do and that we're working on and expanding in other languages. But that's something that we bump against when we're working with certain organizations and trying to advocate for them to apply to other grants, with other institutions who aren't actually translating the materials or don't have folks on staff who speak other languages. So then it becomes a, you know, a barrier to access. I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think for me, definitely, right, we're talking about systemic barriers to entry. And it feels like a lot for me is that there's a huge jump, right? There's a huge jump, I think, from being an arts practitioner to being a professional artist in terms of literally just earning, which I would define in this case as earning a majority of your living wages from arts practice. Mm-hmm. And I think that jump is, I mean, this is kind of the definition, right, of perpetuating systemic inequalities, is that, you know, those with the privilege, those with the wealth, those with the connections to sort of surmount that gap, find themselves on the other side of the ravine. And those who don't, right, continue to create art and continue to practice art, but without making that transition. And we all sort of know, or at least I think many of us on this call know how arts funding works, right? Grants work, right? The more work you have on your CV, the more cosigns you have, the easier it is to get more cosigns. But it's that sort of catch-22 where it's saying, hey, no one has cosigned me yet. Therefore, no one else is gonna, you know, when they look at my artist resume, when they look at my, you know, body of work, they say, where is it? So I think it feels like, for me, so many of the opportunities that have come about are because certain organizations or certain individuals saw what I was doing as sort of, you know, I think of it like sports, you know, it's an amateur trying to go pro. And they saw that there was some promise there. And they said, hey, well, you know, we'll give you a shot. We'll give you a short artist residency. We will, you know, underwrite, you know, a couple of months of you just working on your next project. And that was what let me do that next project, which led to a tour or led to, you know, an exhibition or led to inclusion and curation in something. And so, you know, if there's folks on this call who are on staff at organizations or have the opportunity to give artists a shot, I think know how crucial it is for a rising artist to have the cosign, the rubber stamp on their CV that says this work was considered worthy of inclusion in this, or, you know, this organization said that this artist is doing something that's culturally significant, is communally, socially significant. Because this, I'll end with this. So I did my master's degree in Asian American Studies and Liberation Theology. And this is something that my academic mentor taught me. He said, look, you know, when we give an award to a student, it's more than just, you know, the $500 or the $1,000 scholarship they get. what that means is, because he runs an Asian American Center. He says what that means is when that student graduates and goes, puts their CV in, puts their resume in for a job somewhere or a PhD program somewhere, then they have an organizational, institutional backing, a cosign that says this is an exceptional person. And that's something that I think so many marginalized communities lack, is we just don't have that institutionalization of the cosign. We have the informal cosign. We have, oh yeah, everyone in Chinatown knows this person. Oh yeah, everybody in East Los knows this person. But the more we can institutionalize and formalize that, the more that gets our people in front of certain panels or certain opportunities looking like they're ready to go.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, Jason. And I think what that also says to me is, getting access to those institutions, getting access to those leaders that represent institutions that can co-sign an artist, having that network to be able to plug in that way, forming some sort of mentorship relationship with folks so that you can get co-signed in that way. On top of what I'm hearing Betty say too, we've got a lot of language access barriers too. We've got a state that I think really prides itself on having the most amount of languages spoken, but the limitations that we have for the application and the, all of the ways in which we communicate opportunities are limited to a single language. And so I'm hearing that as some of the barriers. Any other thoughts on this, Erica, Fabian, to add to barriers?
Yeah, just to add on, the discussion about developing that pathway, when you see in school districts, first thing they cut is education arts programs, right? What does that do to students' mentality about, all right, is this a viable career pathway? So, from the get-go, I think we need to do more, public officials need to do more to protect arts and education, so that they do, the future is possible within this field. And so ultimately, I think it comes down to having information and making sure that people are aware of what's going on in each of our communities, and coming together to have a nationwide system of support that extends into our communities and our school districts. And, I think we can do more to support all of our communities together.
Yeah, really appreciate that point you just made, Erica. And it's surprising to look at workforce pathways in other industries, healthcare, you name an industry, and there are clear sort of design pathways into those fields that sometimes are not so clearly articulated into the creative workforce. And so really appreciate the point that you just shared. There's a lot of great work being done in this space, but we've got a lot more work to do. Fabian.
No, yeah, and I think for me now, and I'm hearing Jason share, and now on top of that, let's talk about non-formal education, right? I'm a self-taught artist, and someone that had to find his escape and building up my own craft. And it's amazing when we're talking about this, because we're not so far from what took place like 10 years ago, in a way that, and if it wasn't for this woman, there was a woman by the name of Sandra Quintana, and I was in 2007 when she saw me in a little article, and she said to me, Fabian, what do you want to do? And I said, well, what don't I want to do, right? I'm a dreamer. I have all this imagination, and she goes, you know what, Fabian, let me tell you how this works. Where do you paint? I said, I paint in the kitchen, in the living room, in the staircase, wherever I find space. And she goes, it's just too bad that this world lives on perception. And so what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to create that beautiful perception that you're a professional artist, and meet me in downtown. So I go to downtown, she gives me a studio free of rent, large scale, New York style loft. And then she goes, here, do unto others what I've really done unto you. Now, if it wasn't for Sandra Quintana creating that perception for me where folks come in and now respect me because of the loft and the fancy high state-of-the-art studio, I probably wouldn't be where I'm at today. And it's just too bad that the world spins in that way. And so for me, and she kept investing until this day, she's still investing in me because, private funders are the best funders. And I think for me, those private funders who believe in your trajectory and how you're moving and how the impact you bring to a community and the ripple effect it causes. That's why I compel and I lean more on private funders who entrust in me and who believe in what I've been doing throughout my years. Because when we talk about federal funding, it comes with many strings attached. Evidence-based practices muddy up the anecdotal measures that come from the arts, and sometimes it's not as effective because you said it's not, because it's not in alignment with those requirements of measurements, right? As we're getting ready to go into the measurements. And so then for me, is to think about that, because that's also very exclusive. And I think for me, it would be great to get to a place where we begin to credentialize lived experience to live and exist as professionalism, because not all of us have the privilege to go and get that master's degree because of our circumstantial barriers. But how do we create something just as attracting that can come and stem from within the community that is really going to position and place the folks we work with into that creative and economy, to that workforce, right? What does that really look like? I know I have the framework. A lot of us have been working towards this. I know I have, and it's just a matter of breaking through that, because that mindset, westernized mindset, lens, clinical, black and white type of shit, it keeps us, it's the cap that we're like, man. And so I think I'm glad that Erica's here, and hopefully the federal funding start to think about how do we soften up those requirements and criteria to really be inclusive of lived experiences and self-taught artists who are also impactful in communities. That's what I would like to see.
Appreciate that. Credentialized lived experience, non-formal education. How are we accounting for that? Thank you for that. I want to sort of pause here because I want to turn it over to Kara and see if we have a question from our audience before we continue the conversation.
We have one question, and I welcome anyone to add questions into the Q&A box as we go along here. I'll share what has been shared from Jackie. If your elementary school age selves had access to adults and artists who cared before your major points of trauma, what would have been the most effective ways that could have been supported to mitigate further pain on the walk to where you are now? Jackie teaches 2nd to 6th grade and asks this to support these innocent young artists today in real time. Thank you.
I just want to jump in because this is an accurate question. In 8th grade, I had a teacher who ripped my artwork. And in 8th grade, I used to lean on art as a form of healing and something that would allow me to escape my reality, right? And so this teacher took it upon himself to rip my artwork, which caused me to throw a desk at him. And Fabian was the bad kid who got expelled from school, right? But the teacher never got held accountable. I also believe that it is important for Alley Unified School District and that system to be a little more flexible. I think the teachers are restricted. There's not only so much a teacher can do. And I've been in these spaces and places bringing art workshops for the elementary school students. And it's about trying to, for me personally, after that incident, now I know to come in and let's be realistic, depending on where the school is at geographically, we cannot pretend and continue to live knowing that these kids are not experiencing any social injustices, whether it's domestic violence, alcoholism, drug addiction, single mother, deprivation of food. We cannot pretend, and the school system doesn't seem to make room for that. But the arts work are now as instrumental in the way that we can come and get at some of that. And so for me, it's about having a lens that invites us to really figure out where these things are stemming from. So I'm considered the disruptive kid in class, the class clown. Fabian doesn't pay attention. Fabian doesn't want to do his schoolwork. Well, that's not really my interest. Maybe it's more about drawing in class, right? Well, let's focus on that. Let's hone in on that strength. And I think the school doesn't make room for that. But personally, as an instructor, I think it's important, to invite the LA Unified School District and that system to see how much more flexible they can be to invite someone like myself or any other community artist that is in tune and on the pulse of the community and understands the culturally responsive and culturally sensitive to what it is these kids might be experiencing in order to be effective by utilizing the arts. And that it would be support for the teacher in a very strong way because, it removes all the limitations that a teacher may have. So how do we build on that, right? And that's another system that needs to be revisited and shifted at the same time.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say the great thing about the arts is that there's continually creation, right? So there's resources out there generated from all kinds of different points of view, and number one thing is, schools, teachers, educators in our country are drastically underpaid, given the impact of your work. But I'm sure you got a million things that are pulling on your time. But part of it, I think, I always think about how when I was a kid, my mom actually had me read this young adult book series, Dragon Wings by Lawrence Yep. Lawrence Yep is a Chinese American young adult and fiction author. And I feel like, ironic, it wasn't in school. It was through the influence of my parents that I was exposed to points of view that mirrored ours, to points of view that were drastically different from ours. But whether it was through reading or they take me to art museums, just being exposed to things that validated our social location and our experience, and then things that completely challenged it, that was so powerful. So I think, as an educator, one of the most powerful things you can do, right? You're only yourself, but because of the arts, there's access to other voices, and pulling in and bringing in disparate, voices and points of view and perspectives into your classroom, I'm sure will be encouraging to those who can relate, and challenging in a healthy way to those who may not be able to.
Those curricular restrictions are very real, and I think it looks very different in each state and district. So, but I think it's great that it's this topic is coming up. I think to that I would say, it's important to see within the school's arts, it's not just a particular class or a particular time that we do the arts, right? It should be embedded throughout. The first year that I taught, I was at a Waldorf-inspired charter school, and arts is infused in all subjects. Instead of writing an essay, students might express their thoughts through a watercolor painting, right? So I think if we can make the shift of how we do arts and how that's tied to the school day, and if we can better embed that, have a more fluid connection between the school day and what's happening in the community, I think the role and people's perception of art's role in our lives can be widened.
Yeah, the only thing I would, I just want to affirm what everyone is saying, and about how arts and culture are essential. And I also mentioned culture always in relationship to art, because I do feel like it's inseparable. And it's also about young people being able to see themselves reflected in the art making that they're doing at school. So not just any kind of art, but art they can identify with and relate to, and also that, as Erica is saying, that it's tied to other parts of the curriculum, right? Like ethnic studies might be a very clear and obvious example. And then lastly, just that even though the question, of course, was pointed at young people and how, how can we intervene at a young age? Young people are, often part of a broader community, which sometimes includes somebody who's parenting them. And so, the approach that we've tried to take at ACTA2 is just to really try to reach parents too, and create like healing circles for parents too, and also integrate arts and culture for parents and have it be something that does, where there's this multi-layered kind of approach. We're working with teachers, parents, students, so that they can also be in conversation and work together, and find their own healing. As we know, we live in societies where there's lots of harm. So just important to think about all the different folks who are involved.
Fantastic. So I think we've got another question or two, but I want to make sure we touch on one question, and maybe if we could do just a quick round from all of us. But this question is about indicators. And part of what is so incredibly difficult for organizations and for movement builders to do is to measure progress. How do we know if we're moving the needle? Can you all help? How do you all define progress? What are your indicators? How do you know if you're being successful in advancing the social justice and racial equity conversation through the arts?
You know, that's a very tricky one, man. It's been right. So how do we get creative around it? I mean, we recently picked up a pretty nice sized diversion grant for the academy, which is for 18 and 26-year-olds. And so what we've learned is like how we're measuring that is by what it is the needs. Right? So we have a high need, mid need, and a low need. And then you have judicial impacted and gang involvement, that's a high need. A mid need, it could be a system impacted young lady, single mother, not gang involved. And so we kind of measure it. We use those elements to help us then utilize and reinforce their participation, their consistency, and then the art in itself. And then because we were instrumental in putting the arts disciplines, the healing circle in itself is where the measurement's at, because that's where the anecdotal storytelling connectivity is coming from in those healing circles, which signify the markers that have been met. And then we just language it. And that was intentional because there is no other way that we got, because again, we get consumed by evidence-based practices, all these other needs. But we thought it would be great to implement a healing circle through this 6-month process, which is going to give us the narratives and the stories and the measurements, the anecdotal measures that are going to correspond to the high need, the mid need, and the low need. Now, we haven't figured out a name for it. I mean, matrix, I don't know, there's so many things out there, but I think for us, that was one way that we were able then to reinforce the power of the arts and not get it so consumed by the mental health, because mental health and the arts, sometimes I feel mental health overclouds the arts and its effectiveness. But I gotta say, and so how do we separate and distinguish it? Because art therapy is not restorative arts practices in a way, right? The language. And so and so that's how we've been doing it. And I think in the healing circle we have a better gauge in measuring what the effectiveness of the arts have been through the voice and the experience of the youth in connection to the healing process. Now, I don't have a name for it, or we don't know what to call it, but I think that's been giving us the information needed to really attest to the power of the arts.
Appreciate that, Fabian. And I don't mean to throw out the most difficult question as the lightning round question, but but thank you for that response, Fabian. And any other thoughts are welcome. I also want to flag Roberto Bedoya, I think has hand raised, but if you can put your question in the chat, Roberto, that would be incredibly helpful. And to our panelists, any other responses on the question of indicators?
Yeah, I think, oh yeah, I was gonna say one way that we are measuring, and I agree with Fabian about, being able to measure that also through people's stories and how they're describing their own healing. And another way is, through the leadership that people are building up. So, we've been able to work with folks in the community who perhaps didn't identify as an artist, but had cultural practices that they had been developing and caring for, over generations, things they learned from their grandparents or their parents, like quilting, for instance. And so one example is an artist, Juana Mena, who we've been working with over several years, who's a community leader and who led quilting workshops tied to this idea of healing and restoration with other moms at Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights. And so after that whole series of workshops for about over a year, now we're kind of entering a different phase of, thinking about the women who participated in those workshops and what are the cultural practices that they have also been, nurturing in their own lives and for their own families. And how can we now sort of turn to them and have them lead a workshop that's about that and help them build out, well, what's their, what are they taking from these workshops and how are they kind of digesting it and understanding it for themselves, and how can they kind of teach us now what they've processed and understood. And also just to say that Juana, was mentored by Omar Ramirez, who's another artist that we work with and who Fabian works with as well. And so it's sort of these different layers of mentorship and transmission that are very kind of central to the traditional arts and other cultural practice that I feel like is also for us a way of measuring just how this is being sustained and how it's impacting people over time.
That's so helpful.
Yeah.
Mentorship and transmission. So helpful. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I think sort of similarly to Betty, I've been thinking less about product and more about process recently, which is to say, if, we believe in equity, then that has to start at home, So for example, last year, we put out this album, Face Value, myself and Alan Z, a Chinese American rapper from Atlanta, and it was about Asian American history. And so one of the things that we took the time and took a lot of effort to do was make sure that diverse Asian American voices were represented in front of and behind the mic, So we took time to make sure that the features, the people who wrote and contributed to the album were East, Southeast, South Asian, women and men, and we had equitable representation there. We made sure that our producers included, Asian American, Pacific Islander men and women. And it definitely took more time than if we just said, oh, we'll just, go with whatever's easiest, fastest, most obvious first comes to mind. But I think for me, something that has really changed in my artistic process is understanding, like I was saying earlier, rootedness and integrity and grounding, and improving the process of what we're doing so that what we're saying has integrity with how we're saying it and where that's coming from.
It's a lot of knowledge that you just dropped there. I think the measuring that progress, less focus on the product, but the process that leads there. Really important. Any other thoughts on this? And also, Kara, I'm not sure if we have any other questions from the chat that we want to.
We sure do, if we can squeeze one in a couple minutes here for the panel. Great, I'll start with the first one here. I have found that a challenging area is intersectionality and community support among different cultures. For example, solidarity among different groups, etc. Have you found this to also be problematic in creating true racial equity in the arts?
Yeah, so, if I could, real quick, 2 stories. For one thing, there was a time I was at what was supposed to be, a progressive artist gathering thrown by a foundation. They're doing a showcase of some work that they'd commissioned. And I was backstage, and I heard somebody, it was another person of color, making a remark or telling a joke in like a stereotypical Asian accent, and I did not stand for that. I spoke up, and this supposedly progressive organizers of this event did not appreciate that, and they said that I was being threatening and out of line, and then vice versa. You know, we're throwing this hip hop tour with the Black artists from Harlem and 2 Chinese American rappers and different openers, and I think that this will always, you know, the thing, the arts are no better than society. You know what I'm saying? Just because we're artists or we're working in creative fields doesn't mean we're not human, you know? And the full spectrum of humanity, our foibles and our flaws and our failures, and the finest of what we can do and bring to the table is going to be on display in the arts sphere, perhaps even heightened, because it has so much to do with creation and with taking what's inside and putting it outside. So I think you're absolutely right, Lorena, that this is absolutely problematic. But I think that creating equity, real equity, is always going to be difficult, right? And so I always think of the words of Yasin Bey, also known as Mos Def. He says, people talk about hip hop like it's a giant living in the mountains that comes to visit the people. Hip hop is where the people is at, you know, where our hearts are at. And this kind of goes into what I was just saying about, you know, process. It's not enough for us just to say like, hey, you know, we're creating and we're artists. We have to really interrogate ourselves and the attitudes that we bring into these spaces, and check our privileges and our oversights, even as we try to create things and spaces of flourishing and sharing.
And I think, as you share, Jason, I think that's also an invitation, you know, and I think if we're trying to model what equity, access, inclusion, all those things mean, that it is important for us to be mindful of that. And so I can't sit here and pretend I know it all. So it's how do then we build community back to that. So this is why it's intentional when we bring in the traditional practices. Of course, it's important that we invite the Tonga elders. When we have African-American folks in the space, we have to find the Nigerian drummers, and then, you know, and make sure that we are responding to the culture as intentional and effectively by mirroring, you know, culturally relevant processes for them as well. And so that is also what I've discovered and I've learned. You know, if it's a challenge, it's more of an invitation. How are we bringing folks together, various cultures, to correspond to our audience or participants in this way? And that in itself is an amazing approach, and it has been effective, and it brings community along. And I think ACTA does that. You know, ACTA has been instrumental in doing that as well. I've seen them, you know, inviting various cultures to correspond as to meet that need, if per se, right? And so, no, I try to refrain myself from perpetuating, you know, that type of stuff. So I kind of, it's my duty to build community and find those right people for the right populations that we're serving, to build that community stronger and concretely.
Thank you for that, Fabian. So I just want to take a second here to thank all of our incredible panelists here, Jason, Erica, Betty, Fabian. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this conversation and sharing all of your experience and all of your knowledge with such generosity with all of the audience here. You are deeply, deeply appreciated. I want to also just thank the CAFTA CAA staff for all the work that they've put into organizing this event for our audience today. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kara, because I know that she's got a couple of final words as we continue our celebrations for Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month. So thank you all, and I'll pass it over to Kara.
Thank you so much, Gustavo, Fabian, Betty, Jason, and Erica, for all of the wisdom you shared here today and for the work each of you do. I know that this conversation warrants much more than 90 minutes, but I do have the task of wrapping us up and just want to offer a few a little bit of information about what remains of Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, with the activities we have in store, along with my colleagues here. Just a reminder that this conversation was recorded and will be sent to everyone along with resources and links today. Eduardo, next slide, if you would. Just wanted a quick plug for the 2 remaining webinars in our webinar series. The Arts Work to Create Jobs, a fantastic panel on next Friday, the 22nd at noon. And then another great panel, our last one of April, is the Arts Work to Heal on April 29th at noon. We hope you will join us at those panels or register so you can receive the recordings and the materials. And I'm actually going to toss it over to my colleague Eduardo to tell us a little bit more about our activities.
Hi, thank you, Kara. That was a great conversation. Want to share our toolkits to amplify the messaging of the ways that the arts make an impact, and toolkits to communicate this impact to legislators and just kind of celebrate it in the public imagination. So we have these downloadable toolkits that have weekly themes, and you can just cut and paste them and share them on your social media. We have summaries where you can extract information and just uplift the impact of the arts. A proclamation guide to engage with legislators and such. So do download our toolkits and amplify this messaging throughout the month of April, which is Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month. We are also showcasing, inviting artists to submit artwork to our Arts Work Showcase and Award. We award weekly. We announce 2 winners weekly, $250. So we're inviting artists to submit around the themes of Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, which are how the arts work to advance social justice and racial equity, build community prosperity and resilience, how the arts works to heal, engage and empower youth. So we do invite you to submit work around those themes and enter an opportunity to win $250 a week. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tracy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Of course, Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, as we uplift the incredible work that all of you are doing across the state and connect each other, we're also working to draw attention to our impacts in order to influence budget and legislation process that's currently in play. And so we ask for you to get involved. You can get involved in our action alerts, which would involve maybe phone calls or letters that you can automatically send through our system. We'll share a link in the chat get you up to speed on what the budget asks and legislation is this year as well. And we've got through that ACCM website, that main page, you can do a postcard party to send notes to your legislators, etc. So next slide, please. Great. And getting ready for Advocacy Week. If you'd like to participate in any of these actions, this is a conversation. It'll be in a meeting format, just an hour on Wednesday, to talk about what's on the table and what's in play this year, talking points and a background on some of the legislative priorities and how you and your voice can help advance our sector and support artists and creative workers and culture bearers moving forward. And so you'll find out about how to register for that conversation as well on the calendar page that we shared in the chat. And that's it for me. Oh, wait, I think I've got one more. Oh, and of course, a deeper way, a way to stay deeply connected and move this work forward and keep it free to everyone is to support us as a member, either Californians for the Arts, the statewide advocacy network, or California Arts Advocates, that's CAA, that's your direct lobbying organization in the state. So thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Kara to close our time.
Yes, thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to our board members that joined us today and to our sponsors for Arts, Culture, and Creativity Month, and of course, to our fantastic panelists and moderator for today's amazing conversation. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.